We now have the pleasure of hearing from Bob Rubin, who is our 70th Secretary of the Treasury, and I'll cover his life in the interview, but briefly, for those who may not be familiar with his background, Bob is born in New York City, raised in Miami Beach, graduate of Harvard, summa cum laude, attended Harvard Law School for 3 days, quit, went to London School of Economics, came back, went to Yale Law School, graduated, practiced law in New York at Cleary Gottlieb, and then got a job at Goldman Sachs in the risk arbitrage department, rose up to head that department, and later became the co-senior partner and the co-chairman of Goldman Sachs. And after 26 years there, came to Washington to run the NEC, which he helped to create at the White House under President Clinton. After 2 years of that, he became Secretary of Treasury, served for about 4+ years. And during that time...
4.5.
4.5 years. Okay, and during that time, we actually had as a result of his efforts, among others, a budget surplus. Now that is when the government of the United States takes in more money than it spends. So a rare thing, 3 years.
You got that down, right?
Right, a rare thing. And then Bob became the chairman of the executive committee of Citicorp, did that for a number of years. Now he's a senior counselor to Centerview Partners, which is an investment banking firm in New York. And he was the co-chair of the Council on Foreign Relations with Carla Hills for a number of years, about a decade, and also was the co-founder of the Hamilton Project.
Yep.
And now he has a new book called The Yellow Pad. So what is The Yellow Pad? What is the meaning of that title, and why did you now want to write a new book?
Okay. David, about 3.5, 4 years ago, something like that, I was thinking to myself that I've seen a fair bit of life. David just went through the resume. The resume is the wrong word, but through the life history. And I felt like reflecting on it, but not to look backward, but to look forward. And so I spent about 3.5 years, maybe 4 years actually, writing this book. And I wrote about policy issues that interested me. I wrote about investing, management, all sorts of other things. I spent my whole life around investing. But underlying it, David, I think this was the key, underlying it was a view that all issues are about uncertainties. I took a course in philosophy at Harvard sophomore year. A man named Demos, Raphael Demos, taught it, and he took us through the great thinkers of the ages, much of which I didn't understand, but nevertheless, for those of you who read those things, you'll know why I didn't understand it. But anyway, I still got an A in the course, I might add. But what occurred to me after a while was he had an underlying purpose, and the underlying purpose was to give us a sense that nothing was provably certain. And if you once you reach that conclusion, then it seemed to me, but this was my own extrapolation, that all issues and all decisions are about probabilities. And it's that view, David, that underlies the whole book.
Okay. Well, from reading the book, which I did read and enjoyed, I took away...
How many did you buy?
What?
How many did you buy? You all that carried interest that you got. What did you do with it? You could have bought a lot of books.
Well, as I recall, you have a son who was interested in carried interest. He supported it at one point. Didn't you? Your son didn't persuade you that carried interest was good?
He still supports it.
Okay. So Bob is not a big fan of carried interest, but we'll put that aside for a moment.
I think it's a major national issue. I agree with you about that.
I think it is important.
Yeah, it's just we have different views on it, on that issue.
So, okay, let's talk about...
No, I want to talk about carried interest.
Carried interest. So the yellow pad, essentially, what I took away from it is, when you have a decision to make, outline the pluses and the minuses of the decision and look at it in a very careful way. And you've tried to do that in your life, but you point out in the book, sometimes you made decisions that were rash where you didn't use the yellow pad approach, and we'll go through that in a moment. But let's take you through your life a bit. I just gave you a very summary of it. But you grew up in Miami Beach, and so were you a superstar athlete? Were you a great student?
No, I certainly wasn't anything of an athlete. I liked athletics, but I didn't want to do. They do a lot of running and stuff to get in condition. I didn't want to do it. So I went out for one of these teams, and I thought it was ridiculous. They keep running up and down the field, and I wasn't going to do that, so I stopped.
So, all right. So you must have been a pretty good student. How did you get into Harvard?
I was a pretty good student. I wasn't a great student, and I wasn't going to apply to Harvard. I did well on one kind of thing, aptitude tests. I did well on, but I wasn't a great student, and I wasn't going to apply to Harvard. My father said, "You should apply to Harvard," and I said, "It's ridiculous. I'm not going to get in. Why bother applying?" So he finally said, "Apply," and I did.
You got in.
And I got admitted. And as you know, I think this is in the book, about, I don't know, a few years ago, I was on the Harvard Corporation for 12 years, which is the governing board of Harvard, and then on the finance committee, which you, of course, were, for 8 years. So it was 20 years I was in the governance structure of Harvard. I called Bill Fitzsimmons, who was a good friend of mine. Well, good friend, overstatement, but I know who I know well.
The Dean of Admissions.
Dean of Admissions, yes, Dean of Admissions. And I said to Bill, do me a favor, just look back in your records and see how I got in, because I think it's sort of strange that I got in. But I said, one thing you've got to promise me if you do this is you're not going to withdraw the acceptance. So he called me back about, 3-4 weeks later and said, I'm not exactly clear how you got in.
So, if you hadn't gotten into Harvard, where were you going to go?
Columbia.
Columbia, okay. You got into Harvard, but you must...
Yeah, Columbia's a really good place. It is, yeah.
So you graduated summa cum laude. So how did you do that? You had top 1 or 2% of the class. So what did you major in, economics?
About top 2.2%, just to be a little...
Really?
Not that I paid attention, but...
Okay.
It's strange. I don't know, David. I honestly don't. And I was a pretty good student. But I must say, I was not one of the people that the professors got friendly with. I wasn't somebody who people looked to and said, gee, there's a great student. And somehow at the very end, when they added all the pieces up, your grades and the general exams and my thesis, and I don't know, that's where they came out. So that's what they did.
All right, so you went to Harvard Law School for 3 days.
Yep.
Why not 4 days, or why not to finish the first year at least?
Well, 4 days would have been 35% more than 3 days.
Okay,
No, I went to Harvard Law School, and it was the damn darndest thing. People were buying textbooks. They were talking about torts and contracts, all kinds of things that I had, and with great intensity and concern. I had no interest in any of that stuff. I thought, I got to get out of here. So I called my parents and said, I'd like to go to the London School of Economics for a year, and then I'll come back and do whatever I'm going to do. And they were okay, which surprised me a little bit, frankly. But then I went to the Dean of Admissions at Harvard, because that's what you had to do. And this was 3 days. I said, I'm withdrawing. He said, you can't withdraw. I said, well, I think I kind of can if I want to. And he said, well, we won't readmit you. So I said, well, you ought to look at my record. Maybe you will. So then he said, okay, he looked at it. He said, well, if you will go to a psychiatrist and get a letter from a psychiatrist, and I'll send you to somebody, that says this is a rational thing to do, then I'll readmit you. So I went to see the psychiatrist, and when we finished, he said, you're fine, but I think this Dean of Admissions should see me.
okay, so you went to London School of Economics.
Oh, that was a great year, David.
What did you do there?
Well, I was something I don't imagine they have this anymore, but in those days they had a thing called not occasional, I think it was called occasional student, something like that. I don't know what it was. So I got a little room, and I would go in every morning when I felt like it, and I would look at the list of lectures being given, because that's what they post them there, David. And I'd go and do what I wanted to do. So I basically had a year of no responsibility because I didn't get grades. And
Okay, all right, so...
did what I wanted to do.
All right, so when you want to go back to law school, why didn't you go back to Harvard?
2 reasons. One is I had the impression that Yale was had a more liberal artsy kind of orientation. And number 2, I had an impression that Yale would be easier.
Okay. All right, so you went to Yale. How did you do there?
Now, let me say, by the way,
Yes.
for many years now, the relative yields of roughly 83% of the people accepted at both Harvard and Yale law schools go to Yale these days. That wasn't true those days.
And you had some famous people in your class?
Well, we had 2 who ran for president, Gary Hart and Jerry Brown.
Were they better law school students than you, or?
No.
No. Okay, so you graduated from Yale.
I wasn't a terrific student either. Well, I was pretty good, actually. But Jerry, who was a terrifically interesting guy, as you know, Jerry was close to the bottom of our class, I think. I may be wrong. I don't want to get sued for slander. So maybe that's a long time ago. I could be wrong. Maybe he was a star.
Where's Jerry Brown? Was he at the top of the class, or?
Jerry Brown?
Yeah. Jerry.
Only if you looked at it with a telescope.
Okay, so you graduated from Yale Law School, and you went to work in New York as a lawyer at Cleary Gottlieb. And did you love the practice of corporate law?
No, but I thought the firm was terrific, David, and I still do. Just culturally, I liked it. But I was there for about a year, and I figured, A, I'll never become a partner. And so it's a question of how long you stay before you leave. And secondly, I got very friendly with a 44-year-old partner who graduated first in his class from Harvard Law School, terrific guy. But I watched what he was doing, and I thought to myself, number 1, I'll never be him. And number 2, even if I did become him, which I won't, I don't want to do what he was doing. And then I was working on some investment banking project as a junior lawyer. And I thought to myself, what they do is a lot more interesting than what we're doing, and they get paid more for it. So if that's the case, why don't I go there?
So was it hard to get a job at Goldman Sachs? You had no finance background. How did you just apply and they just said yes?
No, it really was the strangest thing. I really did have quite a good resume in college, as David said. So I sent out a letter to all these different firms, figuring they would all offer me jobs, and then I decided where I wanted to go. 0 people offered me jobs. And I don't think that's because they knew me or something. It's just, although maybe they did. Maybe they checked around a little bit and they said, well, who wants this fellow on our? I don't know. Any of it, nobody offered me jobs. I think the reason basically, Dave, was in those, it was a long time ago, the firms were much smaller and they weren't hiring lawyers.
All right, so how did you get to Goldman then?
Because I met somebody who in turn knew a partner at Goldman. And the partner at Goldman, luckily for me, although I had no way of knowing this obviously, was really wanted to leave Goldman, but he felt he had a very, very special job at Goldman, and he felt he couldn't leave unless he had somebody there and he could develop somebody to take his place within relatively short order. And he offered me a job to do something called risk arbitrage, which I knew nothing about. And this was an example of a decision, David, where I didn't do any probabilistic analysis or anything. I just said, I want to do this. And I did it, and it turned out that temperamentally, it was a high-risk business. This was a business where you were committing the firm's capital, and you could lose a lot. In 1980, 1 month in 1980, we lost more money than the whole firm had ever made in a year. So this was a high-risk business. But it turned out that temperamentally, psychologically, I was well suited to it.
For people that aren't familiar with risk arbitrage, essentially you're betting on announced mergers, whether they're going to be complete or not. You're not anticipating somebody is going to buy a company and getting there ahead of time, which often involve inside information and so forth. You wait for a deal to be announced and you assess the probability it's going to close. And that's what you were doing.
Yeah, that's what I was doing. But the problem, David, you're assessing those probabilities. And if you turn out you think the probability is whatever, it doesn't matter, 70%, and the 30% materializes, you can lose a lot of money. It was a very high-risk business, but it was at the center of the firm's profitability.
All right, but saying you lost a lot of money the year you just referred to, were you afraid you might get fired?
No, my mind doesn't work that way. The question was, what should the firm do? And I went to the then we had co-senior partners. I went to the co-senior partners, and I said, look, we've had these very large losses, but I think what we should do is look at every position. That's what happened, David, when it was the post-Volcker period. And I'm sorry, not the post, it was the Volcker period, and interest rates went way up, and that changed the environment for everything that was going on. At least most of it was gone. So we really did lose a lot of money. So I went to the 2 of them, and I said, at that time I was a sort of a lower middle level partner. I went to them and I said, here's what I think we should do. I think we should take every position. I think we should analyze it probabilistically, okay? Risks, rewards, in terms of current conditions, decide which ones to sell, which ones to keep, and maybe even, in some cases, add positions. And they had a partners meeting, and none of these people understood arbitrage. They were all investment bankers. And I went through this with them with the whole partnership. Remember, this was their money. We were a partnership. We were a public company. And at the end of it, they said, okay. I think most firms, as you suggested, David, would either have said, get rid of these positions, we can't live with this, or we'll get rid of these positions, or else we'll get rid of you.
All right, so you headed up the risk arbitrage department, obviously turned things around, did well, and you rose up to be, with Steve Friedman, the co-CEO of the place. What did you do that deserved to make you the co-CEO? Were you a very big profit maker, or you just a nice guy, or smart person? What is it that led you to be the co-CEO?
Can I choose amongst the 3?
Any of those. Probably can't be all 3.
I'll take nice guy.
All right. So
I think, David, what happened was that it sort of was almost an organic kind of thing. Steve and I actually became the co-COOs, but John Weinberg, who was the CEO, didn't want to deal with managing the firm. He wanted to deal with clients, at which he was extremely good. Yeah, he was extremely good at that. So Steve and I ran the firm for 7 years, first as COOs and then as CEOs. It's funny, David, and I've been through a lot of search processes of companies, so I know this is not usually the case. This was a case where it was just sort of organic, it was natural. We were there. I was running, by that time I was really responsible for all the risk activities, and Steve was head of M&A and basically head of investment banking. And we were the natural people to become the CEOs, and we did.
Okay, all right, so you did that for a while, and you were involved in politics. You were helping fundraise for some Democratic politicians, right? And the reason you were a Democrat, not a Republican, is because a lot of people in Wall Street are Republicans, not all, of course, but so you were always a Democrat?
Yeah, but I don't think, yes, I was always a Democrat. Initially, it's because my parents were Democrats. My grandfather ran, not in earners living this way, he earned his living as a lawyer, but he ran the most significant political club in Brooklyn in the days, David, when those political clubs really ran Brooklyn. And so I'd seen this, and I guess for whatever psychological or other reasons, it's something I always wanted to do.
Right, so you supported a candidate who was a governor of Arkansas named, Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton.
So you supported this candidate, wasn't that well known then, and after he got elected, did he say to you, guess what, I'd like you to be something or another? Did you ask him for a job, or he just called you up?
No, it was the strangest thing. I got started in politics in 1972 when I went to Joe Fowler. Joe had come, I don't know if any of you remember Henry Fowler called Joe. He had been Secretary of the Treasury, then he came to Goldman Sachs. And I said to him, I'd love to get involved in Democratic politics. Got any ideas? He said, I will introduce you to Bob Strauss. And I don't know how many of you knew Bob, but he was a remarkable human being. I thought the world has changed. You couldn't be a Bob Strauss today, but he was, and David, of course, knew him well. So I worked with Bob on raising money for Democratic candidates for the Senate and the House. And then as time went on, David, I got more and more involved with different, and then particularly with Fritz Mondale, who I thought was just terrific. I think he would be a terrific president. You knew him well because you were in their White House. And then Clinton ran. And what he did was he took about 8 people. I didn't raise much money for Clinton for some reason. But he took about 8 people or so, and he used them as outside validators for his economic policies. Since I thought what he was doing was sensible, not in every single instance, but for the most part, I was very happy to do that. When he won, they called me, Warren Christopher, Chris, the head of the transition, called me, said, come down, the president-elect wants to meet with you. So I went down, I spent 2 hours with him, David. And when I finished, I called my wife and I said, this is the damnedest thing. I spent 2 hours with this guy. He's going to be president of the United States. He didn't ask me anything about economics. He really was trying to figure out what I was all about.
Okay, so some people might say that the person who is running Goldman Sachs might be, like Joe Fowler, qualified to be Secretary of Treasury, but they offered you a staff job in the White House. So one day you're running Goldman Sachs, you've got thousands of people working for you, and the next day you've got a windowless office in the West Wing on the 2nd floor. Did you ever think twice about taking that job?
Here's another instance where I didn't go through a probabilistic process. I was asleep at 2 a.m. in Germany. I was visiting a client, and the phone rang, and it was Warren Christopher, and I'd known Chris from other things. He said, the president-elect would like you to be head of the new National Economic Council. And I said, okay. I had no idea what this thing was going to be. I had no idea whether one could make it work. When I got home and I told my wife, she said, don't you think you should have talked to me about this? And I said, well, I think we did talk about government at some point, didn't we? And she said, yeah, but we didn't talk about you moving to Washington. But David, it's fun, I've thought about this. I didn't go through any probabilistic process, and people like Fritz Mondale told me, not well afterwards, not at the beginning, that I was crazy, because how the hell are you going to make something? We set something up. What President Clinton was set up was like the NSC, and the cabinet members would all, in effect, work through the NEC and coordinate, and then bring him whatever sorts of views they had through the NEC. And people said to me, you'll never get it to work. No cabinet member is going to agree to go through you. But you know something? It did, and it worked because he supported it, David. If he let people go around it, it never would have worked.
So you took the job, and were people Goldman surprised that you would leave for a newly created staff job in the White House, or they said it's a great job?
Oh, I think a lot of people were very surprised, David. And as you said, Steve and I were running Goldman Sachs, a pretty significant place. But I never felt that way about it. In fact, I felt that when I went into the White House, on Inauguration Day, I walked in with Gene Sperling and Sylvia Matthews, now Sylvia Matthews Burwell, and we walked into the White House. I looked at Sylvia and Gene, because they were going to be part of my little NEC group, and I said, okay, now we're in the West Wing. What do we do? So I had not the foggiest notion what to do, so I called my parents, and I said, I'm in the White House, and that's what I did. But Sylvia and Gene figured it out, and so we
after about 2 years, Lloyd Bentsen became Secretary of Treasury at what today seems like a young age. Then it was considered old. He was 72.
Yeah.
He's too young to run for president at that age, so so at 72, he decided ultimately to retire, I guess, and maybe run for president later when he was a little older. So you were offered the job Secretary of Treasury, and did it take you a long time to say yes?
No. No, what happened, the president never offered me the job.
How'd you get it then?
Leon Panetta was chief of staff. He called me one day, because I was always back and forth in the Treasury and the White House. I said, come on over, I got something to talk to you about. I said, great. So I came over to the chief of staff's office, and Leon was sitting there. He said, the president would like you to be Secretary of Treasury. So I said, well, okay.
All right, so you got the job, and you were confirmed 99-0.
Well, it was 99-0 with one abstention.
Oh, so one person was...
J. Rockefeller was out of the country.
Oh, okay. So, well, it's very unusual to get confirmed that readily today.
That wouldn't happen today, David.
So you get the job, and then all of a sudden you've got some problems on your hands. Mexico is going bankrupt. Did you say we should bail out Mexico right away?
I'll tell you what happened. I went to the Oval Office with the General Counsel of Treasury, my wife, and a few other people, and the president swore me in. Then Larry Summers was there. So then everybody else left except Larry and me. And Larry, Alan Greenspan, myself, and Stan Fisher at the IMF had been talking about Mexico quite a bit in preparation for whatever we were going to do. So we went to President Clinton and we said, we think we should provide a very substantial financial support program to Mexico, albeit it had to be conditioned on Mexico doing this, that, the next thing. And it was very interesting. Remember, he had just gotten killed in the 94 elections. And George Stephanopoulos was there, and there was somebody else, I've forgotten who. And they said to him, the politics of this are terrible. And even though the politics were terrible, David, he looked at it, he talked about it. We said to him, and we said, this is a matter of probabilities, and there's no guarantee. This could not work. And he looked at it, he said, this is what we're here to do. We did it. And he decided to do it.
All right, and so it worked. Government made a $580 million profit, more or less, ultimately.
You know, I don't remember the number, but I do remember we made a big profit.
Okay, well, that's in your book. But,
it's in my book. Then it's probably that, and then we had 2 and 20 for it.
Okay, well, you should have. You shouldn't have got a carried interest on it.
That's why I have a strong views on carried interest.
All right, so let me ask you, how did you come about, there were budget deficits for a long time. What did you do that helped engineer the budget surplus? I think there were 3 years, the latter part of the Clinton administration, where we had budget surpluses, which were unheard of at the time.
You know, David, it's an interesting story in what it says about today. In '93, we passed the Deficit Reduction Act, and we passed by, if I remember correctly, 1 vote in the House, and I think 1 vote in the Senate. I may be slightly off on that, but they were very close. We were sitting in there's the Oval Office, and there's that little office right next to it. And the president was in the little office right next to it with a few other people, and I was there, and it was very close. We almost didn't pass it. But that was a totally partisan vote. But in '97, and this is what I think is interesting, in '97, the president and Erskine Bowles, who was the chief of staff, were negotiating with basically Trent Lott about what we should do, and we got ready for the final phone call, and I said to Mr. President, one thing we cannot do, because it does us no good economically, and there's all kinds of other reasons not to do it, is lower capital gains taxes. He said, I understand that, we will not lower. I said, terrific. Then he got on the phone with Trent, and he started talking to Trent Lott, and they were back and forth, and all of a sudden I heard him say, well, Trent, you want lower capital gains taxes? And he said, yes. He said, okay, we'll lower them. And I was sitting there like this. This is the one thing we agreed not to do. But you know something? That reflected extremely well on him. Because what he understood was, the 2 things he understood about that, well, he understood a lot of things, a very bright guy, but the 2 points were, one, that once again, this was a matter of probabilities, was it right or, but secondly, he was willing to engage in the give and take of compromise, do something he didn't want to do in order to achieve what he thought was a bigger purpose. That doesn't happen today.
So do you support the lowering of capital gains anymore?
I'm as negative about today as I was then.
Yeah, but today, do you generally believe in the lowering of capital gains tax, or you're not a big fan of that?
I think that and carried interest are in the same category.
All right, so you're Secretary of Treasury, and you have, about 2 years to go, you step back and you leave the government. Now, a lot of times people at the height of their power, which you had as Secretary of Treasury, say, hey, I'll stay for another 2 years. Why did you leave 2 years before the administration was over?
Well, it was a year and a half, actually.
A year and a half, okay.
Yeah. I've been in government 6.5 years. As some of you know, because you've been in government, it is all-consuming. And I will tell you, we had the Mexican financial crisis, the debt limit fight in 1995 was much like it was this time, except it went on longer. And we had to shut down the government. We had the Asian crisis. We had a Russian crisis, which had all sorts of geopolitical complexities to it. I was just tired. And finally, when the impeachment thing was over, I was going to leave a little bit earlier, David, but I felt I couldn't leave as long as the Asian financial crisis wasn't resolved, and as long as there was an impeachment process going on. But once those two were done, I really need to get away.
So when you're Secretary of Treasury, you get to have your signature on the dollar bills. Is that a fun thing to do? And you show your parents here my signature on the dollar bill. Did you do that? A lot of Secretaries of Treasury, I know, they get them printed up and they send them to people.
They send them to people?
Yeah, well, not for free though. But.
Oh, I don't say that would be. I wouldn't send $1 to somebody for nothing.
So,
I mean, I'd sell it to them for $1.50 or something.
So when you hand a dollar bill to somebody,
Goldman Sachs for 26 years. Why would I give somebody something for nothing?
When you hand a dollar bill to somebody and it has your signature on it, you ever point that out to them?
No.
You didn't do that? Okay. All right, you're more modest than some people.
Well, I remember one who carried a big, remember?
Yes. So, all right, so you joined, you had
My problem was different, by the way, and this is true. They brought me a big piece of paper and they say, just sign it here and then we'll. The trouble is my handwriting isn't very good. And they had a very hard time finding a signature they thought could work on the dollar bill, but finally we got it.
Okay, it worked out. So you left and you became the chairman of the executive committee of Citicorp. And while you were there, Citicorp had a problem, as many people did in 07, 08. You point out in your book that the city didn't really look adequately at the mortgages they were more or less agreeing to lend. What was the problem?
I wrote a lot about Citi in the book because I think there's a really important story there. The debt securities were rated AAA. And in those days, there was a pretty much universal view in Wall Street that if something was rated AAA, it had, for practical purposes, no credit risk. It might have interest rate risk, but no credit risk. And so they had developed this very large position in the trading areas. And I think the lesson from that, which, by the way, nobody else knew about, and it's not their fault that nobody knew about it, they just, well, I shouldn't say not their fault, but it wasn't that they were trying to hide anything. It's just that they would give a risk report to the senior management, to the board, and then the senior counsel. I was actually senior counsel was my title, but at that point, we would get it. But this position was never on it because they felt as a AAA security, it had, for practical purposes, virtually no credit risk. But obviously, once we found out about it, it was too late. You couldn't sell it. But the lesson from this, and I write about this quite extensively in the book, is that you should never assume anything, and there are no certainties. And if there are no certainties, then there should be no assumptions that you take. So what I suggest in the book, and what I suggest in the book, was that you should try to figure out what assumptions are you making in whatever it is you do, whether you're investing or you're doing something else, and then don't take an assumption for granted. Examine it.
Well, let's talk about the current situation. The big R. Do you think we're going to have a recession anytime in the near future?
Well, the chief economist of Goldman Sachs, who's a very, very capable guy, said yesterday or 2 days ago, whatever, he thinks there's a 20% probability of a recession. I don't know what number I'd put on it, David, but I talk to a lot of people. I have some advisory positions that I invest for funds. So we talk a lot about this sort of thing. I think the probability of recession is pretty material. I don't know what number I'd put on it, but you think about it for a moment, David. In the June inflation number, the core CPI number was 4.8. I know the headline number was 3%, but that was a product largely, David, of consumer energy prices going way down. And the core CPI number, which is what economists ordinarily look at, was 4.8%, just down slightly. So I think what we have right now is an inflation that we have not yet tamed. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope we have a soft landing. But I think the probability is not. And I think the probability is that we will continue to have an inflation problem. The Fed will have to deal with that. And then there are a lot of other factors, David. Commercial real estate, the growth in China. What Paul Volcker once said to me, and I've never forgotten it, Paul said, albeit in a different context, but Paul said to me, when you get a little bit of inflation, it takes on a life of its own because of psychology. And when you get a little bit of recession, this could also take on a life of its own. So for all those reasons, I don't want to put a number on it because I don't actually have I haven't had a quantitative view of this, but I do think the material chance of a recession.
Okay.
And hopefully there won't be one.
All right. So let me ask you, do you think the Fed has done a good job in fighting inflation with these rate increases?
Well, as is, I think, almost universally recognized now, they did a not good job at the beginning. And here you had inflation, and Larry Summers wrote about it early on, but forget Larry's, I think it was the Washington Post, if I remember correctly, but forgetting Larry's views at the time, as you looked at what was happening, it just seemed to me pretty obvious that when you do a risk-reward kind of analysis, the Fed should have been much quicker and much more aggressive. Then once they got on board, I think they did about, at least in my opinion, for whatever it's worth, in my opinion, they did about the right thing. I personally would not have done the pause, because I think the pause simply feeds expectations. It runs the risk of extending this inflationary period longer. And until we deal with inflation, it's going to be a continued threat in terms of slowing down or even recession in the economy, as well as inflation itself having all kinds of negative consequences. And I think we just got to deal with it.
So talk about
and the sooner you deal with these things, David, I mean, you know this better than I do, the sooner you deal with inflation, the less harsh you have to be and the less of a cost you'll pay.
Talk about the debt. The United States has a staggering amount of debt now, $32 trillion.
No, it's not 32. Everybody keeps saying that. David,
you're talking about the internal and external?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. The external debt is over 20-some billion.
Well, no, the internal is about, let's see, GDP is 25, so the debt must be about 22 or 23 or something.
Okay, so difference between internal and external, but still it's a lot of debt.
It's a lot of debt.
So how do you solve that problem? Are you ever going to get back to a point where you can get some budget surpluses again?
David, I think our current fiscal trajectory, the CBO in their last projection actually, the CBO projected that debt to GDP, which is now 98%, would go to 118% 10 years from now. But almost everybody, not almost, probably just about everybody I know who is serious about fiscal matters and who really is deeply involved in thinking about them, thinks a more realistic estimate might have been 130% or 135%. That's not a question of CBO. They operate under certain constraints. And I think it could be even higher than that, given and you can see it all over the world now, the geopolitical challenges we're going to face. So I think we're on a terrible, terrible fiscal trajectory. And I think sooner or later, we're already paying some price for it in inflation and in constraints on public investment, which is a really, really important factor. And I think at some point, we'll pay much larger costs for it if we don't do something about it. And I don't know how we reestablish the kind of environment we had at the end of the Clinton years, when there really was basically a broad-based political willingness to deal with our debt, or our deficits, rather.
Okay, so let me ask you this. When you were the Secretary of Treasury, you consulted with Alan Greenspan, Chairman of the Fed, a lot. Do you think it's a good idea for the Secretary of Treasury and the Chairman of the Fed, who's supposed to be independent, to be consulting a lot? And do you see much of that these days or not?
Well, what happened was that Larry Summers, who at that point was Deputy Secretary, I think he thought he was Secretary, but actually wasn't. He was Deputy Secretary. There was me, and there was Alan. And we would have breakfast once a month. And I think for 4.5 years, we would have breakfast once a month. And I think they were some of the best times I've had in my entire life. Nothing ever leaked. 4.5 years, and this is Washington, mind you. And nothing ever leaked. And we would discuss everything under the sun, not only economies, but politics and gossip and whatever. The one thing we did not discuss was interest rates.
Oh.
And our theory of the case, David, was that we could discuss GDP, everything that might affect interest rates, but we never discussed interest rates. And our theory of the case was that the Fed's independence, both privately and publicly, should be respected.
Alan Greenspan, I think, was the chair for like 18 years or so. And he talked in what's called Fed speak. It was hard to understand him. When you were having breakfast with him, could you understand what he was saying?
That's not an unreasonable question. Yeah, I mean, if I didn't, I could ask Larry what he meant, and he would tell me. But yeah, I mean, Alan was an unusual guy. I think it was terrific. He had a good sense of humor that wasn't always manifest. Yeah, I think so. But I'll tell you what happened once at a hearing we had. We had a hearing, Alan and I were testifying. There was a senator, with all due respect to that senator, wasn't all that bright. And he asked Alan a question, and he had no idea what the hell he was talking about. So Alan said, well, is it fair for me to interpret your question as being X? Well, the senator had no idea what Alan had said, but he had a terrible choice. If he said no, then he had to explain why. And since he didn't understand what Alan was saying, he couldn't do that. And if he said yes, then he was off in some place by himself. So he finally said yes. Then Alan gave a really good answer to his own question. And then he looked at the senator and says, does this satisfy you? And the senator had no choice. What was he going to say? He had the foggiest idea what Alan had said. So he said yes.
So on outside activities, you participate in a sport, I guess it's a sport, called bone fishing, or I guess you do fly fishing, right?
Fly fishing,
So
yes.
why is that so appealing?
Well, I don't know how many of you fly fish. I know. I just love it. 35 years ago, I was exhausted, and I went down to a place in the Bahamas. And when I was a kid in Miami Beach, I used to fish with a spinning rod. So I took my spinning rod, my wife and I went down, and I saw some guy with another kind of rod, and I said, "What's that thing called?" And he said, "It's a fly rod." So I said, "Let me try that." And I've never had any other kind of rod in my hand since then, and I just love it. I love being on the water. I love being on the water in Montana. I love being down in the Bahamas. And David, it's almost like a Zen experience. You sit there, and you get caught up in it, and all of a sudden, you started at 8, and all of a sudden, people who've done it are all nodding their heads, and all of a sudden it's 4:30 or 5, and the sun is starting to go down, and it's time to go in.
But you ever thought that your brain is this big and your fish is this little brain, and outsmarting that little fish brain, why is that so hard?
Well, I had the same problem with other things, where people whose brains are about that. So remember, I was in Washington for 6.5 years.
So did you ever consider running for office?
No, I would be a terrible candidate, David. I promise you, I would be just an awful candidate.
So those people that know you well know that you very frequently say things like, "I don't know much about this," or "Just as one man's opinion," or "I could be wrong on that." Why don't you say, "I'm the Secretary of Treasury," or "I was the Secretary of Treasury, and I really know what I'm talking about here"? How come you never do that?
Because I don't believe that's where any of us are, David. I think we all have a highly imperfect understanding of whatever it is we do. I think we're all highly fallible, and I think it's a pretty good idea to recognize that. And so when I say something like that, David, all I'm trying to say is, look, I have a view, but you may have a different view. You may be right, I may be right, and why don't you take my view into consideration as you think through your own view, but I'll take yours into consideration.
Two final questions. You've mentioned your wife twice. You've been married for 60 years, something like that?
60 years, that's correct. Yeah.
You should know. But
Yeah,
okay.
but don't. My hesitation was off the record.
Okay, all right. So 60 years, more or less.
Yeah,
And you've got 2 children and 4 grandchildren.
correct.
And any of them want to be Secretary of Treasury, or?
I don't know what they want to be. You know, David, when I never wanted to be Secretary of Treasury. When I was in 4th grade, I had one big ambition, which was to get to 5th grade. And when I was in 5th grade, I had another big ambition to get to 6th grade. And I lived my whole life that way. Just sort of do what's in front of you, do it as well as you can. And, what'll happen will happen.
Okay.
I don't know what they want
So
to
I think we have a copy for everybody of your book. And my question is, since everybody will have a copy, what should they take away from reading your book? I assume everybody will read the book very carefully today. They'll probably finish it today. What do you hope that people will take out of your book?
I guess if there are 2 things, well, it's a good, nobody's ever asked me that question. But I guess if there are 2 things, it would be one thing. Well, one thing, by the way, there's no limit on the number of books you can have. So if people want to buy more, you certainly can buy more. But I guess, David, it's the uncertainty and the complexity. And, we live in an age, this is my view, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that if you look at the short term and the long term, the uncertainties and the complexities are as great as any time in my adult lifetime. On average. Now, there were individual moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is, but take away the individual moments, and I think this is the most uncertain period I've been in. And I think, so the answer to your question is, it's the underlying proposition on my part that everything is, I don't think it's not proposition, I think it's a reality, that everything is about uncertainties, everything is about complexities, and the best way to deal with that is probabilistically. I also think you ought to take into account something that I write about in the book. It's very valuable, I think, to have a questioning mindset, and that was sort of the point about the city. Whatever it is you look at, look under the hood, try to figure out what it means.
You're most proud of having done what in your entire career? You're most proud of having run Goldman Sachs, the Treasury, NEC, Council on Foreign Relations, this interview. What is it the most proud of?
I think you got the right idea, knowing you.
Okay.
No, I don't know, David. My mind doesn't work that way. It really doesn't. I just kind of do what I've tried to, I kind of do what I do, and what happens, happens, and
All right.
go on to the next thing and so
All right,
forth.
the real final question, the most impressive public official you ever dealt with?
Well, I don't plan to make that many enemies by naming one person, but I must say, I do think Bill Clinton was a remarkable, is still, but as president was a remarkable person. He understood, first, he's smart as can be, and secondly, despite all the political difficulties, some of which he created for himself, he basically did what he thought was right. I gave you an example. He got killed, as you'll remember, in the midterms in '94. And in '95, in January of '95, we went and said, we want you to do this thing, and it's very unpopular politically, but we think probabilistically it's right. And he said, this is what we're here for. And the same thing was true about, and I think about it, when on deficit reduction stuff in the '93 Deficit Reduction Act, he said the same thing. He said, sure, we have to raise taxes a little bit, we have to cut some spending, one thing or another, all of which is unpopular, but that's what we're here for. So I would say, look, I've known quite a number of people in public life who I have a lot of respect for, but I think I'd probably put President Clinton first.
Okay, Bob, I want to thank you for an interesting conversation. We have a gift for you I'm going to give you right now. His gift, you can have a photo here, and we'll send this to your office, okay?
Wow.
Okay,
Thank you.
Send it to you. All right, thanks a lot, Bob.
David, thank you. This was fun.
Thank you.